I'm Dr. T, and welcome to my living room. Today, I'm playing the game Banished, which is, for those of you who haven't played it before, a game that starts out with about 10 folks who have been banished from their homelands in medieval Europe and must make a home in the wilderness. And well, making a home in the wilderness does involve building a community and eventually raising kids, and well, where you have kids, you have education. And I'm not going to jump too much into the historical relationship of medieval education, other than to say I'm fairly confident to say this idea of, the vast hordes of unwashed, illiterate, uneducated peasants is probably a bit misleading. Formal education like we know it doesn't exist up until the last couple hundred years. But let's not try and get, too nuts with extending that out to times in the past. Things were different. But with that said, on topics I'm not covering, let's talk a little bit about education. So it looks like school's coming out for today over here. So I'm an educator, and thus, jumping in with the whole, education thing. Education in some respects has not changed that much since antiquity. It definitely hasn't changed a lot in the last couple hundred years once we started really formalizing it and actually, making sure everyone went to an actual school. And some of that is, not good, and other parts of that are, frankly, there's a reason we're doing it this way. So presumably at my school over here, or at the other one across the river, that these students are going in. There's probably, well, there's a teacher. I hired them. There's a teacher, probably a big slab of slate, some chalk, and they're writing out some words for the students to memorize, teaching them to do some, times tables, that kind of stuff. At least assuming the school is based on, ones from, say, the 19th or 18th century. Once again, not entirely sure how things were done in the medieval period. And the students are learning to read. They don't go particularly long through school. There are no high schools or universities in Banished, although I think one of the mods does have that. And then the students will then be better workers once they grow up, more efficient with the logs and that kind of stuff. And some parts of that, that's in some cases how we learn. You just need to be told stuff at times. If you want to learn material, the easiest way is to go, this is a fish. Not holding a fish, but, otherwise, how else are you going to get that? But in other cases, that is in some respects not a particularly great way of doing it. So if you're down over at the docks, a better, not necessarily a better way of learning, but yeah, a better way of learning is, okay, let's work with these fish. Okay, you see this fish? Let's look at this fish. Notice which fish you're catching with this hook, and discovering material on your own. This is what we call active learning. Now, of course, if you're doing it on the, the fishing dock, this would be a learning on the job kind of scenario. But as humans, we're actually really good for that. That's why play exists. Children play to learn, and to, grow muscles, etc. But really to learn. And that's, to help them grow and to do more, they play. So trying to make that an artificial, here's what, we do, blah, 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 that's definitely problematic. Sometimes it's about as good as you're going to get, depending on your content. But in other times, a lot of cases, it's much, much better students discover it. And so as an educator, one of my focuses is to use the lecture, here's what you need to know. Use that when I need to, but try and do much more discovery-based, much more active learning. Ones where the students are given a problem, or they're given a set of scenarios or information for them to work on. And then instead of me telling them how to solve the problem, they solve it. And in that way, they will learn it. Now, obviously, there can be problems with this. If I throw them off the deep end, you might not swim. So I can't give you too hard of a problem if you're one of my students. I have to give you a reasonably structured problem so you can definitely find the solution. I'm not just going to send you the docks over that way, get me a ton of fish kind of thing. We're going to work on this. I'm going to help you out. But that does mean that my teaching does not resemble all that close to the school teachers in this particular virtual schoolhouse teaching style. And I get a lot of complaints on that. Students are very used to just being told the information. They're very, very used to PowerPoint. PowerPoint has been a blessing and a curse because it allows you to really take the information, put it in a structure that's frankly better than textbooks. The textbooks have existed since antiquity. These folks probably have, depending on what part of the Middle Ages this is, they probably have a textbook. If it's late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. Early Middle Ages, those would still be hand done, so less likely. So they're probably not really having a textbook, and even then, it's probably not every student gets a textbook. But textbooks, especially once printing became cheap, were the way of doing education. Everyone had the book. You basically read the book. The instructor explained the book to you. At this point, if they were to go on to kind of a university level, quite often, especially if this was early Middle Ages, universities existed, kind of the mid-Middle Ages, I should say, somewhere 1200s, whatever you want to call that. You get universities, and quite often that would be you've got the tutor or the instructor of whatever type, and they would be literally reading the book to the class. And that's because you had a book. Books were expensive. Books were ludicrously expensive. So you might have something like Ovid or I'm probably going to pick a book that wasn't discovered at that time, the Iliad or something. Some classic Greek or something or other, or Latin. Yeah, mostly been in Latin. And the main goal was simply to read the book to it, and then they would talk about the book. Okay, if you noticed a cut there, that was my antivirus going, hey, we have a new product. Ugh. Anyways, and thus it was a very basic education. I mean, the actual learning activities were very, very streamlined, very very inefficient. But most people weren't going to university. And the amount to learn was not a ton back then. But of course, as the amount we need to learn, the amount of people who are trying to learn it has gone up, then, we need to use better and better approaches. So I have basically given up on PowerPoint because that really gets back to this kind of schoolroom version. This is no different than me writing on the board. Actually, in many respects, it's worse than me writing on the board. Because when I write on the board, I have to streamline what I say. I can throw everything on this PowerPoint slide. I can throw fancy pictures. When I put it on the board, I have to streamline it, make it more efficient. And the students can take notes, and when they're taking notes off of the board, one, they actually have to take notes. Otherwise, they don't get a copy. And the act of taking notes really does help in the learning process, whereas simply looking at a PowerPoint is an absolutely horrible way of learning. You need to take the material that you're trying to learn and reformat it repeatedly. And so if you're doing that either from PowerPoint, you can take notes from PowerPoint, but you have to actually take notes from PowerPoint. You can't just have the copy of the PowerPoint, look at it, and think that's good enough. But if I'm doing it on the board in chalk or whiteboard or whatever, then in that case, I am streamlining the notes into a way that much better fits into the way the student would want to put that into their notes. So that's going to change what's on there, kind of clarifies things. At least for me, that's what works the best for me. I learn much better from chalkboard. The other problem I see with PowerPoints, and one of the things I've seen go away once I've really gone away from them, is students will look at the PowerPoints and they'll think, okay, I know this material because I know this PowerPoint. And when the PowerPoint's away, the student doesn't know the material. And so I used to get tons of comments. I still get some of them. But I used to get tons of comments from students like, I knew this material, I knew everything, I had it down pat. But then when the test came, it was just out of my brain. Now, some of that is nervous, or some of that is being nervous and fearful of the test, which is a byproduct of our test-centric way of teaching, which is not something I can change. This is a much more society-level thing. But other parts of that are that the student recognizes they are learning the material. They have not learned the material. They recognize the material. They can utilize the PowerPoint as a crutch to help them finish in those small gaps, very much like training wheels. So, a small child's learning to ride a bicycle. They're using the training wheels, and, minor mistakes they make, the training wheels stop before they fall over. That same child, when they're still learning to ride the bicycle, hops on a bicycle without training wheels, they go 5 feet and fall over. And that's, really a function of they were learning how to ride a bicycle. They haven't learned how to ride the bicycle yet. They've got about 90% of the way there, but 90% of the way there is nowhere near 100%. And so you need, support for that last 10%. Well, on a test, you're not getting that support. That's why it's a test. If you got the support, that would be homework. So by not having the PowerPoint per se, it really alleviates a lot of the students' temptation just simply to stare at the PowerPoint over and over again. Instead, to engage with the material in ways that are not just looking at the PowerPoint, and thus they get a better feeling for what they really understand. Now, conversely, though, and there has been a couple of scientific studies on this, that students will feel like they're learning more when they are being lectured to, when they're simply being told the material. It feels like you're learning the material, even though it quite often, for the majority of that content, in one ear, out the other. Whereas when you're doing active learning, actively engaging with the material, and by the way, I'm not saying chalkboards are great. I'm saying they're slightly better than PowerPoints. But when you're doing projects with the material, you're working homework problems, you have these more engaging activities, things where you're actually working the material. Then you learn it and it sticks with you, but it doesn't feel like you're learning it as much. It feels more like you're doing some stupid chore for no good reason, and you don't realize that in the process you've learned the material. And so this really gets this interesting feedback. So over the last several years, I've cut out PowerPoint mostly from most of my classes. A couple of them, the nature of the class is such that I can't get rid of the PowerPoint. It really is the best tool for that class. Biochem, textbook on one that, PowerPoint is a very good tool for biochem. But I definitely incorporate active learning in biochem, so don't get me wrong. But the more I've cut back PowerPoint, the more I've increased active learning, the less complaints I get, or the less students coming to my office practically in tears going, I don't know how I failed that. I knew all that content. I had that down pat, when clearly they didn't, because they didn't know it. That's gone away, but the number of students are like, you didn't teach anything. We just had to do a bunch of stupid worksheets. And yet, your test scores were good. And as that's transitioned, those complaints have gone up, but those complaints have also correlated with improving test scores. So my test scores are improving. The students are doing better. They are learning the material. But they don't feel like they're learning. And it's this really dichotomy. And it's like, what is my goal? Is my goal to make the students feel good learning, or is it for them to actually learn? And that's the interesting dichotomy, because well-polished PowerPoints, which I'm not good at, but well-polished PowerPoint delivery, very streamlined, is a terrible way of teaching, but gives very good student reviews. Whereas active learning, really making students engage in the material, is the best way we know to teach, but gets absolutely horrible student reviews. So this is really interesting dichotomy. But with that said, if you're a student, I do really hope you're engaging with some active learning. It is a much better way of actually learning the content. Now, of course, I guess maybe that's the misleading part. A lot of education, unfortunately, is not about learning the content. It is about getting certifications to do a specific task, and that's just the nature of economy, or of our economy, and how things work, and that's not okay. We don't need jobs that do not need a college education requiring it. I've worked for places where an entry-level secretarial position required a bachelor's. And it's like, this is ridiculous. This does not require a bachelor's. This requires someone with excellent organizational skills. But, that's what the employer decided. And that I have no control over. So, once again, if you're a student, I do hope your educators are using active learning approaches. It's not going to be as comfortable for you. It can actually be fun, but it's definitely going to be more work for you. But you will gain a better understanding of whatever you're learning by doing that. That said, though, I don't use pure active learning because good luck. It does not always fit well with what needs to be done. Certain content, you just need to be told what it is. And of course, certain people do learn better if you just flat out tell them. So with that said, I have no clue what this lady is doing with that wheelbarrow. Um, and I will see you in future videos. Have a wonderful, awesome day. Goodbye.